I'm Saundra Kelley, and you're listening to a bonus story from On the Drop Side of Yonder, written by Jacqueline Brunet. It's called The Last Tramp. The author intended this as a work of fiction, although it is based on an actual childhood incident. Homeless men of the Great Depression, referred to as hobos and tramps, occasionally came through Gregory, Michigan. And one of Jacqueline's early searing childhood memories was of the time she locked eyes with a man fresh off the boxcar. "Scald those dishes good. They're the ones the tramp ate out of," called Mama, indicating a plate, cup, fork, and knife soaking in sudsy water on the drain board. Loath to touch the objects any sooner than necessary, Katie finished the family's dinner dishes and put them away, including the pots and pans. She wrapped the dish rag around her hand before lifting the plate, cup, and silverware to the dishpan, leaving a trail of sudsy water on the counter and on the floor. Using a fork as a tool, she worked the dish rag around the plate and the cup and quickly lifted the silverware into the sink. She stepped off the footstool, carried the steaming tea kettle from the stove, and poured all the boiling water over the dishes and the silverware handled by the tramp. She left them in the sink to air dry. The ablutions were concluded by the careful washing and rinsing of her own hands to assure the riddance of all residual tramp germs. The advent of a tramp in the small town of Anderson during the 30s was not exactly common. But 8 or 9 times during the summer, a disheveled, disreputable-looking man disembarked from a boxcar attached to the noon locomotive and presented himself at someone's back door, asking for something to eat. The Perkins house, within sight of the railroad tracks, was a frequent target. Usually he ate the dinner, carried to the backyard by Mama, left the premises, slipped back into one of the empty boxcars, and was gone within the hour. A man who did not depart immediately created unease in the residents. They declined to settle back into their comfortable routines until the tramp was safely away, either on foot or transported on a later train, or occasionally with the help of the deputy sheriff, who gave him a ride to the county line. The housewives of the town followed a prescribed system in the handling of tramps. One never sent him away hungry, but one did not feed him too sumptuously lest he be inclined to return. One never let him into the house. Mama was one person who never asked a tramp to work for his meal, although some required services in payment. Katie once asked her mother why she fed the tramps, since they were so obviously dirty, lazy, and sinister. Mama answered that someday one of the Perkins family might be in a strange place and be hungry, and she would like to think that someone would give that family member something to eat. Katie was reminded, she didn't know quite why, of a story in her reading book. Gertrude, a housewife, was asked by a stranger for some food. She put a cake into the oven, but it grew larger until she thought it was too large to give to a stranger. She kept baking smaller and smaller cakes, which in turn grew larger and larger, until she finally told the stranger she could not feed him at all, because all her cakes were too large. The greedy Gertrude was gradually changed into a woodpecker and sentenced to the end of time to peck long and hard for her every meal. Katie wondered if the housewives in Anderson were afraid of being punished in a similar manner if they did not feed the tramps. The almost superstitious fear of the vagrants, who were thought to leave cryptic messages for each other in stopping-off places, was matched only by the dread and suspicion avoided a band of gypsies, which occasionally arrived in town. Although no one had ever known of a documented case, everyone knew that gypsies pilfered property and kidnapped children, and some tramps robbed and murdered upright citizens and terrorized children. The arrival of either in town generated hysterical clucking from one back fence to another until the whole town was notified, resulting in the incarceration behind closed doors of every child in the village and all the surrounding farms. As the tramp ate his dinner on the back porch steps, Katy sidled up to the dining room window where she thought she could get a good look at him through the lace curtains without being observed. She noticed he had graying hair, and it was growing over the back of the collar of his shabby jacket. His face was nondescript, except that his cheeks were sunken, indicating that he had few, if any, teeth. A short stubble indicated that he had not shaved for a day or two. His shoes looked as worn as a pair of daddies that Mama had thrown out. As Katy was assessing his physical attributes and wondering where he had come from, he suddenly raised his head and he looked straight at her from deep-set, piercing dark eyes fixed into a pasty, solemn face. Startled, with heart hammering, she backed away from the window. After the dishes were finished, Katy asked futilely, "Can I go to Shirley's?" "No," said Mama. "Not until we know the tramp's gone." This response confirmed what Katy already knew. A whole dreary afternoon, and a school holiday at that, lay ahead of her in the house. "There's nothing to do," she grumbled. "Why don't you play with your paper dolls?" suggested Mama. Katy examined the alternatives. She wouldn't mind getting out the paper dolls. However, if she had to be confined to the house this afternoon, that meant her 7-year-old brother would be similarly imprisoned. She recalled the last time she played paper dolls, when she and Bobby were confined together. She had graciously included him in the play. The pleasant interlude had lasted only about 10 minutes, after which Bobby tore their heads off and committed other atrocities on her favorite set, and these were the paper dolls sent by Grandma the previous Christmas. She had slapped Bobby, and then Mama had slapped her, and the whole day had ended in a disaster. No, she would not get the paper dolls out today. Katy breezed through 3 books that she had already read 9 or 10 times each, and she and Bobby played toss the beanbags for a few minutes until he began throwing the beanbags at her and finally knocked a lamp over. Mama became cross. Katy then played with the cat and rocked it in the big leather chair. Between activities, she looked out at all the windows to see if the tramp was hanging around. Repeatedly she called with trepidation, the tramp's raising his head and looking straight at her. She wondered if he was annoyed because she had so rudely stared at him out the window. As the interminable afternoon wore on, Katy began to dread the night, for she knew the tramp would not leave her thoughts until she knew for certain that he was safely out of town. She played jacks for a while until Bobby kicked them just as she was getting into her threesies. It was hopeless to trade nicely around with him about. At supper, Daddy and Mama talked about the tramp, and Katy listened in intently. Daddy said the tramp had gone to several houses asking for jobs to do. As far as they knew, he hadn't left town. Katy became more and more uneasy. 8:30 came and Mama started in about bed. Katy delayed as long as possible, but by 9, Mama's patience had come to an end, and Katy had to resign herself to going upstairs to her lonely bedroom. Surprisingly, sleep came rather quickly. Later, how much later, she did not know, she woke with a start. She heard a noise outside her window. Lying stiff and still, she stared at the black rectangle and wished she had a window shade. That way she could have pulled it down. The big maple grew by the side of the house, and it was adjacent to Katy's bedroom. Although she had never tried to climb the tree and get into the room, and had never tried to get from the bedroom window into the tree. She thought it would be possible, and with a ladder, it would be easy. Eyes wide and senses heightened, she imagined the tramp looking through the bedroom window. Could he see her? Would he try to get the window open? Were those his eyes piercing in the darkness? And did he recognize her as the girl who had stared at him through the curtains at dinner time? She thought she heard another sound, but she wasn't sure. It could be the wind blowing the small twigs against the window, or it could be the tramp changing position and getting ready to come into her room. Katy pictured Bobby's warm bed in the next room, and she thought of fleeing there and crawling in with him. But what if he wouldn't let her? Then she'd have to come back to her own room, and in the meantime, the tramp might have come into the room and hidden under her bed. Besides, Bobby would almost surely tell. They had slept together until 2 years ago, and then, without any explanation, Mama had split them up and never let them sleep together again. Katy had been glad at the time, but Bobby had howled for hours every night for a week. Now she would have gladly given him her deserts for the next several days, for the privilege of just sharing his bed. Exhausted from strain and sleeplessness, Katy pondered what she should do. Mama would shame her if she went downstairs and said she was scared. Worst of all, now she had to go to the bathroom. Should she lie there in misery or make the terrifying trip down the hall, down the stairs, across the dark rooms to the bathroom? She could be mistaken. The tramp might really be downstairs waiting for her. On the other hand, if he was outside the window, he would be just biding his time for her to leave. And then he would climb in the window and hide and wait for her to return. Finally, she thought of an alternative, one she did not particularly like, but it was the best compromise she could think of. She would use the old enamel chamber pot in the back of the closet, kept for overnight guests. If she slipped out of bed and crawled to the closet, the bed would probably keep her out of the tramp's sight while she secured the pot and brought it back to the side of the bed. Mama would have a fit if she found out. Mama believed a great big girl of 9 years could just as well get up and come downstairs in the night. Katy would have to deal with that tomorrow. Squirming on her stomach across the cold floor, Katy reached the closet and, without too much trouble, found the pot. She inched back, stopping at intervals to listen for more sounds. The pot made a scraping sound when she set it near the bed. She gasped, and again she listened without moving. Painstakingly she eased her nightgown up, positioned herself on the icy pot, and hunching over as far as she could to be out of line of the vision of the tramp. Did he know what she was doing? Would he suddenly spring through the window while she was so vulnerable? Her tense bladder sent spasmodic stabs of pain and urgency to no avail. As well as she could, she brought her fear and tension under control. She thought of a brook running over sparkling stones, bath water gurgling down the drain, the sprinkling can gently inundating the rose bushes, the faucet sending soft streams of water into the sink. That did it. She started, only to stop abruptly when she thought of the tramp peering in the window. Again she went through the process of calling up visual images of flowing water to stream through her consciousness, to relax the muscles enough to allow her to empty her bladder. Successful at last. Her hands and knees trembled as she eased herself to the floor and crawled away from the vessel, trying to position it under the bed without making a noise. She sloshed warm urine onto her wrist and hand. Startled, she abruptly set the pot down with a twang. She slipped between the blankets, wiping her hand on the spread. Heart knocking against her ribs, she lay listening, occasionally hearing creaks and groans inside the house, and sometimes swishes and flutters of sounds from just outside the window. Katie woke up later than usual the next morning, with the sun striking her full in the face. She bounded down the stairs, delighted to be alive and well. Mama and Bobby were out in the garden. Seeing her chance, she raced up the stairs, grabbed the pot, and hurried downstairs to empty it and return it to the closet before Mama found out. With a dirty sock, she wiped up the spill from the night before. She flopped onto the bed with the arms spread wide, smiling at the ceiling in triumph at having survived unscathed last night's terrors. When Daddy came to dinner, he told Mama. Dan Lewis called the deputy sheriff about supper time last night and told him that tramp was going around town bothering people. He come over and told the tramp to get the hell out of town. Stayed around till he was sure the fellow was a good 5 miles from here. We won't see no more of him. It's likely he's the last tramp of the year anyway. They go down south about this time every year when the weather's warmer. Katie felt as if a large stone had been removed from her insides. No more tramps. Now she could play with her friends and be at ease in the house without jumping every time she heard a noise, and she could sleep peacefully at night. "Can I go to Shirley's?" She almost shouted the question at Mama. "As soon as the dishes are done," Mama responded. Katie knew she and Shirley could spend half the afternoon talking about the tramp. They might even get sticks, tie red handkerchiefs to the end of them, put apples inside, put the sticks over one shoulder, and play act they were the tramps. They could go up to the top of Simon's Hill and sit and eat their apples, pretending they were around a fire, getting ready to hop on the train. And they would have this whole glorious Saturday afternoon to play tramp. She hurried to get the dishes done. At the end of the following week, Daddy came home with an upsetting and astonishing piece of news. The body of the last tramp had been found in the haymow of Runciman's barn. "He's been dead 2-3 days, Daddy reported. The coroner's going to do a post-mortem." 2 days later, Daddy informed Mama that the tramp had died of pneumonia, as nearly as the coroner could tell from the bloated, rancid body. He had further news that tore through Katie like a cannonball. "They say he come from down Pontiac way," Daddy continued. "House and barn burned down towards the end of August. Kinfolk took in the wife and the 4 young'uns. And he'd gone here, there, trying to find work. They were terrible hard up. When he stopped off here, he was on his way to Jackson, or they was hiring up there in the Olds plant." The tramp was only a man, like Daddy, Katie thought. Maybe he had a little girl her own age. That little girl might be crying for her daddy right now. Poor man, Mama said. Poor family. Mama picked up the bottom of her apron and began to wipe her hands over and over as she looked out the window, thoughtfully. Daddy cleared his throat and sat down with his newspaper. Katie went upstairs and sat on the bed, looking towards the window, with a lump as big as a wad of bubble gum in her throat. That night, and every night of that autumn season, after reciting her prayers, she cried over the tramp, believing that she had contributed to his death, without quite knowing how. You've just heard The Last Tramp, and it's from the book The Drop Side of Yonder, written by Jacqueline Brunet.